Elias Thorne, at 32, was a man carved from ambition and honed by an unyielding drive for cinematic perfection. His name, though not yet a household word, resonated with a distinct hum of recognition within the niche world of wildlife documentary filmmaking, where he was known as the "Ghost of the Lens," a filmmaker who pushed boundaries, sought the most dangerous and elusive shots, often at the subtle, unseen expense of genuine connection, ethical consideration, or even his own well-being. He believed he could not only capture nature but truly, definitively, conquer it through his lens, distill its wild essence into digestible, awe-inspiring frames, his relentless pursuit fueled by a deep-seated, unaddressed trauma, the loss of his younger sister, Clara, to a sudden, violent rockslide during a family hiking trip when he was just 15, leaving him with a silent, suffocating weight of guilt and powerlessness, transmuted into a fierce, almost vengeful desire to master, to control, to understand nature through the cold, objective glass of his camera, to prove he could outsmart its unpredictable cruelty, disconnected from human emotion, his empathy funneled solely into the technical mastery of his craft, filming the majestic, but never truly feeling it. For months, Elias had been tracking a legend, an elderly grizzly bear matriarch known among the scattered, respectful indigenous communities as the Silent Weaver, or Old One-Eye to others, due to a faded, milky scar over her left optic, said to be ancient, wise beyond reckoning, fiercely territorial, and almost spectral in her movements, rarely glimpsed, yet her immense presence felt across the vast mountain ranges she roamed, the matriarch of matriarchs whose lineage was rumored to stretch back generations, her knowledge of the land unparalleled, making her capture, not just on film but truly, intimately, Elias's singular obsession, the crowning jewel of his career, the proof of his ultimate triumph over the wild. His target territory was the untamed heart of the Denali Range, a vast, unforgiving expanse characterized by harsh, brutal beauty, extreme, unpredictable weather, and true, unadulterated wildness, where Elias had spent a brutal autumn setting up his advanced, high-tech, long-term wilderness camp, more than a camp, a self-contained surveillance hub, a reinforced, insulated geodesic dome tent, a portable solar array, satellite communication equipment, and a meticulously organized arsenal of the latest filmmaking gear, laying out a network of hidden, motion-activated cameras, thermal sensors, and even miniature, silent drones designed to provide the most unobtrusive surveillance possible, believing he had achieved the ultimate invisibility, the perfect, unadulterated observation point, certain he would capture the Silent Weaver's life as it truly was, undisturbed by human presence, convinced he would conquer her secrets. The initial weeks were a meticulous dance of patience and precision as Elias endured the biting winds, the creeping frost, the profound, deafening silence broken only by the shriek of an eagle or the distant crack of ice. Reviewing hours of silent footage, deer grazing, caribou migrating, the fleeting shadow of a wolf pack, but no weaver, letting doubt, a creeping insidious cold, begin to gnaw at his resolve, wondering if she was even real, if this was truly her territory. Then, in late November, a faint heat signature appeared on his thermal monitor, moving with a ponderous, ancient grace across a distant ridge, then another, smaller, and another, 3 distinct, massive forms, moving towards what his geological surveys indicated was a deep, snow-sheltered cave system, the Silent Weaver and her cubs, 2 of them, surprisingly, a jolt, a surge of adrenaline, far more potent than any drug, shot through Elias. Realizing he had found her, he had done it, his hands, usually so steady, trembling as he deployed more sensors, adjusted the drone flight paths, and began the delicate, silent vigil, observing how the cubs, though blurry on the distant monitors, seemed particularly curious, often straying from their mother's side to investigate a fallen branch or a patch of curious snow. He spent days, then weeks, recording, cataloging every methodical, deliberate movement of the silent weaver as she foraged, guided her cubs, and taught them, feeling a detached sense of triumph, finally capturing nature, raw and pure, exactly as he envisioned, seeing the vastness of the wilderness, which had once felt hostile and dangerous, now like a grand stage, perfectly set for his masterful capture, feeling a thrilling sense of control, of finally being above the capricious hand of nature. His only contact with the outside world a daily, brief satellite radio check-in with his producer, Sarah, a perpetually stressed but fiercely loyal woman back in Anchorage, to whom he'd always reply, "Soon, Sarah, soon. I'll have more than you can imagine," envisioning the headlines, the awards, the definitive film that would establish him as the undisputed king of wildlife cinematography. The shift in weather was abrupt, merciless, beginning with a whisper, a faint moan of wind that spiraled down from the jagged peaks, then escalating into a guttural roar as Elias, reviewing footage of the cubs tumbling playfully in the fresh snow, saw the first whiteout hit, snow, fine as dust and driven by gale-force winds, slamming against his domed tent, reducing visibility to zero as the satellite link sputtered, then died, plunging him into a chilling silence, with only static answering. His frantic calls of "Sarah? Sarah, can you hear me?" Blizzard conditions. I'm losing comms, leaving him alone, utterly, completely alone. The blizzard raged for days, a relentless, blinding fury, the temperature plummeting to unimaginable lows, as Elias huddled in his dome, rationing his carefully calculated supplies, his portable solar array, blanketed in thick ice, ceasing to function, the digital screens flickering, then dying, his high-tech equipment, his armor against the wild, beginning to fail, batteries freezing, lenses fogging, the once reliable drones lying buried under drifts, inert lumps of plastic and metal, the cold, a tangible entity, seeping through his insulated gear, chilling him to the bone, forcing him to melt snow for water, conserving his fuel with desperate care. On the third day, a terrifying sound ripped through the howl of the wind, a splintering crash, seizing him with panic. Scrambling to his feet, fumbling for his emergency flare gun, the sound dangerously close, as he risked a peek through a small, reinforced window port, wiping away frost, seeing in the swirling vortex of white, a shadow detaching itself from the storm. A massive, shaggy form, moving with a desperate urgency, the silent weaver, and behind her, two smaller, shivering forms. Confirming she was here, displaced. Her den he had so carefully monitored must have been compromised by the extreme cold or the snow accumulation. Seeking shelter, heading directly for his camp, as Elias scrambled back, his mind racing, this was it, the ultimate shot. But his cameras were dead, his drone buried, all his carefully constructed layers of separation gone. No longer the unseen observer, simply there. He heard the distinct huff of a large animal, the soft whimpers of cubs, alarmingly close, then a low, resonant growl. A sound that vibrated through the very ground beneath him, not aggressive, but a deep, throaty warning, a mother's instinctual demand for space, daring to look again, seeing her through a break in the driving snow, her dark eyes, one faintly scarred, meeting his through the small window, not with malice, but with a primal intensity that stripped away his arrogance, leaving him raw and exposed, seeing her magnificent, a force of nature, yet also vulnerable, her cubs, small, dark bundles of fur, shivering behind her, huffing softly. A deeper roar of wind, carrying stinging ice crystals, forced the weaver to turn, moving past Elias's tent, her immense bulk seeming to brush against the reinforced fabric, settling herself and her cubs in the lee of a massive rock overhang, barely 20 feet from his own shelter, a narrow, snow-covered alcove, the only shelter available. They were trapped together. The days that followed were a surreal, agonizing test of wills and endurance. Elias ran out of fresh rations, his emergency dehydrated meals tasting like ash, perpetually cold, constantly hungry. His ankle twisted badly when he'd slipped on ice trying to secure a loose antenna wire, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, making every movement a painful ordeal, forcing him to observe, not just film, watching the silent weaver huddle over her cubs, protecting them from the relentless cold, grooming their fur with patient nudges, seeing their vulnerability, their simple struggle for survival, witnessing the raw, undeniable love of a mother, a connection he had long suppressed within himself after Clara's death. One morning, desperately low on food, Elias found a small, hidden stash of dried berries and nuts he'd forgotten about. Eating a handful, then, almost unconsciously, pushing a small pile towards the edge of his tent's opening, where the wind wouldn't immediately whisk them away, initially telling himself it was to lure the cubs closer for a hypothetical, impossible shot, but the truth was, his heart ached for them, watching, hidden, as one of the cubs, a particularly brave and curious one. He started calling him Curious, crept forward, sniffed cautiously, then devoured the berries with astonishing speed. As the weaver watched him, her scarred eye seeming to pierce through his thin tent fabric, reading his intentions, simply observing. The shared silence became a language, the soft huffs of the cubs, the rhythmic breathing of the weaver, the constant moan of the wind, all becoming part of Elias's new reality, finding himself talking to them, whispering explanations of his futile attempts to fix his radio, apologizing for his intrusion, muttering stories to the cubs. He, the man who had always sought to control the narrative, now a mere character in theirs, completely vulnerable, utterly dependent on the capriciousness of nature and the silent tolerance of its queen. The blizzard continued to rage, though with less intensity now, the snow piled higher, burying his last functional solar panels, his emergency stove flickering, threatening to die, Elias shivering uncontrollably, the persistent cold seeping into his very bones, hypothermia a very real threat, his twisted ankle swollen to an alarming size, turning purple, weak, disoriented, the lines between reality and hallucination blurring, imagining Clara's face in the swirling snow, her laughter echoing in the wind. He had run out of potable water, his melting system long frozen, stumbling out of his tent, grabbing a fistful of fresh snow to cram into his mouth, its icy sting momentarily shocking him back to reality, when as he knelt, disoriented, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, not the weaver's, but sharper, more predatory, and through his blurred vision, Elias saw them, two lean, gray shapes, moving silently through the deeper snow, their eyes gleaming with cold hunger. Wolves circled his compromised camp, drawn by the scent of his weakness, perhaps by the faint warmth emanating from his dying stove, his heart seizing with a terror more profound than anything he had ever known, realizing he was a meal, fumbling for his flare gun, his numb fingers struggling with the cold metal. Suddenly, a shadow, larger than any wolf, moved with astonishing speed, the silent weaver, a dark, powerful blur, lunging from her sheltered alcove, not roaring a challenge, but letting out a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the very ground, her immense form, a wall of muscle and fur, positioning itself directly between the approaching wolves and Elias, not a deliberate act of rescue, not a calculated protection of the human, but an instinctual defense of her territory, of the delicate balance she had momentarily found in this harsh world, and perhaps of the strange, silent truce she had formed with the vulnerable creature near her cubs, as the wolves, sensing the raw, ancient power of the matriarch, hesitated, snarled, circled, but held back. The weaver, a statue of primal power, standing her ground, her scarred eye fixed on the predators, her body vibrating with controlled fury. Elias, frozen in the snow, watched the standoff in a haze of fear and disbelief, realizing this wasn't the nature he filmed. This was nature as pure, unvarnished survival. He was not an observer, he was a participant, a fragile, secondary character in a drama far grander than his lens could ever capture. As the wolves, realizing the cost would be too great, eventually melted back into the shadows, their hunger outweighed by the silent weaver's indomitable will. The weaver did not acknowledge Elias, simply turning, her large head swiveling to check on her whimpering cubs, then settling back into her alcove, resuming her vigil. And over the next few days, as the blizzard finally, slowly began to break, a new understanding dawned in Elias. His arrogant belief in conquering nature shattered. His sophisticated tech, his meticulous plans, his grand narrative, all had failed him. Realizing it was the raw, primal resilience of life, of a mother protecting her young, that had saved him. Seeing the weaver not as a trophy, but as a teacher, seeing the cubs, particularly curious, not as subjects, but as fellow struggling beings. He watched the cub curious once more, nudging a small pile of Alistair's emergency dried berries he had placed out. The simple act of foraging, a pure, unadulterated moment of life, and Elias, with a surge of clarity, reached for his last, functioning recording device, a small, worn field recorder he used for voice notes, now cold and almost dead. Holding it up, not to capture a shot, but to record a profound confession, speaking into it, his voice hoarse, broken, talking about Clara, about his guilt, about his desperate need to control the wild, about how it had consumed him, and then speaking of the weaver, of her power, her quiet grace, her selfless protection, whispering, "I came here to take, she taught me to revere," tears freezing on his cheeks. The blizzard finally broke, the relentless, driving snow giving way to a crisp, clear dawn, illuminating a world transformed into a silent, pristine wonderland. The sun, a cold, distant disk, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The mountain air, though still biting, feeling clean, reborn. The silent weaver, sensing the change, stirred, emerging from her alcove, her massive body shedding clumps of snow, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her cubs, now less chilled, tumbling around her, shaking off the last vestiges of the storm. Looking towards Elias's tent, her scarred eye seeming to hold ancient wisdom, there was no growl, no threat, no acknowledgement of their shared ordeal, just a long, unblinking gaze that seemed to penetrate his very soul. Then, with a quiet huff to her cubs, she turned and lumbered silently into the deeper forest, disappearing seamlessly into the vast, untouched wilderness, leaving barely a trace in the fresh snow, gone, just like that. Hours later, the distant drone of a helicopter grew steadily louder, a welcome, yet strangely jarring, sound. Sarah's search party, finding Elias, barely conscious, hypothermic, his ankle severely sprained, but alive, airlifted out, brought back to civilization, a world that suddenly seemed alien, loud, and blindingly bright, his physical recovery slow, arduous, but his inner transformation swift and profound. The first thing he did, once he had the strength, was to methodically go through all the footage he had managed to capture before the blizzard hit. Days of patient, meticulous tracking, the perfect shots of the cubs at play, the intimate glimpses of the weaver's den life. Loading the raw footage onto his editing suite, his old self would have immediately begun cutting a sensational sequence, a never-before-seen exposé, but as he watched the images, he saw them differently, seeing the Vulnerability, the trust, the sacred moments that his ambition had once blind to, watching the cubs tumbling, the weaver's gentle nudges, remembering her silent strength, her unasked-for protection, and then, with a quiet, deliberate resolve, Elias Thorne deleted every single frame that compromised the silent weaver's privacy, every intimate shot of her den, every vulnerable moment of her cubs, wiping the hard drives clean, leaving only the distant, respectful establishing shots of the vast wilderness, the sweeping landscapes, realizing he had come to capture, to conquer, but left with a profound understanding that some things were not meant to be owned, only revered. His new film, eventually released to critical acclaim, was unlike anything he had ever done, titled The Unseen, a subtle homage to the wisdom of the wild, featuring sweeping, respectful landscape shots, long, patient observations of flora and fauna, not as objects of conquest, but as integral parts of an interconnected web, using his recorded voice notes, his raw, unvarnished confessions from the blizzard, as the narrative backbone, his voice no longer arrogant, but humble, filled with a newfound reverence, speaking of the vastness of nature, the lessons of vulnerability, the silent majesty of true wildness, carefully omitting any specific details that could lead viewers to the silent weaver's territory or expose her, collaborating with indigenous elders, weaving their timeless lore and respect for the land into his narrative, giving voice to a wisdom he had once dismissed as primitive. Elias Thorne never saw the silent weaver or her cubs again, but he carried her presence with him, an indelible mark on his soul, trading his high-tech, intrusive cameras for long lenses and distant observations, becoming an advocate for ethical wildlife filmmaking, for respectful storytelling, for the preservation of wild places not as tourist attractions or subjects for conquest, but as sacred spaces of immense, untamed wisdom. His old need for control, for external validation, vanished, replaced by a quiet, profound reverence for life's intricate balance, finding a new sense of peace, not in conquering nature, but in understanding his place within it, realizing he had sought a trophy, a masterpiece for his reel, but the wild had given him something far more precious, a profound, life-altering lesson in humility, and the unseen masterpiece of his own transformed soul.